Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin, daf kafeh. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the top of our daf. Just to do a quick review, and there's a study guide also that'll help organize today's daf. The Mishna gave 4 cases. Okay, the first case, all different kinds of cases where the get was not written lishma. The first one where the sofer, right, he heard someone calling out, reading out a text, and he said, "Oh, that's my name, that's my wife's name. Let's use that get." Then we took someone else's that was written in someone else's name, and then he took it because his name matched, and right, that person didn't want to get divorced anymore. Then we have a person who had 2 wives, and he meant to divorce one. They both have the same name, and then he decided to divorce the other. And then we had the last case, which is the one we're going to focus the most on today, which is he said, write it for either which one of my wives, and then later he decided which one he'd wanted to divorce. That also doesn't work. So now we saw at the bottom of Kaf Dalet Amud, a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. We're going to see 2 more opinions in this machloket about whether, while it's true none of these gets work, the question is, are these gets enough, though, to basically disqualify this woman to kohanim, to say that there's something of divorce here, some sort of reason to be stringent? Either what we saw yesterday was reach haget, which is there's something of a get there. She did get a get that had her name on it, that had some intent there, and that was the question. So Rav said all of them actually disqualify her, because this is called reach haget, other than the first one, because the first one wasn't really a get. Okay, again, we discussed yesterday why the first one would be different. Shmuel says even the first one doesn't even disqualify. Shmuel thinks none of these actually have reach haget in them, and right, so again, Rav says not the first one, yes, all the others. Shmuel says even the first one doesn't. Now we're going to move to Ze'er. Ze'er Amar, Kulan ein poslim chutz min ha'acharon. Only the last one is actually a problem. Okay, the last one disqualifies. Why the last one? And this is for a different reason. He doesn't hold his reach haget, but what does he hold? This is a concept that we call braita. Braita is retroactive designation. Since it was undesignated at the time when he wrote it, but he basically left it open so that he could decide later. When he does decide, perhaps we say, now you'd have to say that Ze'er only thinks perhaps, because if we definitely say there is braita, well, let's talk about what braita means. What we're going to say is that when he does decide which one, it's as if it was determined from the beginning. Now, we don't say this definitively, because if we said it definitively, she'd be divorced. So the only thing here is, do we have to be strict and say l'chumra? We have to say there's braita, and we have to say that maybe braita works. Now, if braita were to work, that would mean this woman has a divorce document. She's a divorced woman. We're not going to treat her as a divorced woman, but enough to say that she can't marry a kohen, or if she's married to a kohen, she has to get divorced from him. V'chein amar Rav Asi. Here's strengthening of Ze'eri's position. Also, Rav Asi said this. Hulam ein poslim chutz min ha'acharon. So none of the others disqualify, only the last one. But Rabbi Yochanan amar af achronami eino posel. Okay, so Shmuel. Okay, so let's go back for a minute. I think I might have said Shmuel opposite. I hope I didn't say that wrong. Let's just review. I hope if I did, I'm going to correct myself now. I can't even remember now what I said 3 minutes ago. Okay, so let's just pull up the study guide and we'll see it inside here. Rav says all of them disqualify from the kahuna other than the first one. The first one's not really a get. All the rest are enough of a get that it's like we call reach haget, or possibly he holds braita, right? And therefore it's a problem. Shmuel said all of them disqualify a woman from marrying a kohen. We're going to view these all as problematic, even the first one. Ze'eri is going to say none of them disqualify other than the last one. Only the last one disqualifies, because we're concerned that maybe we hold there's braita. Rabbi Yochanan says even the last one isn't posel, because we definitely don't hold braita. So certainly not the others. We don't even think it's reach haget. And even the last one, we're definitely not concerned because there's no braita. So now we're going to show that Rabbi Yochanan, as Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei, he's consistent with his approach, because in a different place, he holds there's no laws of braita. What's the case? To Amar Rabbi Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, ha'achim shechalku be. By the way, we learned this in Beitza. Ha'achim shechalku lekuchotem. Brothers that divide up their father's inheritance are considered as if they purchased from the other, meaning all of the land equally belonged to all the brothers, and each one purchased his portion from the other. So if, let's say I have sisters and we've divided up our inheritance, because we'd only divide up if we were only sisters, no brothers, then basically I would buy from you your part. I wouldn't actually do this, but it's as if I bought from you your part of my property, and as if you bought from me, purchased from me my part of your property. Now, what's the relevance of this? Whatever divvying up we did at the time of my father's death now goes all back to the way it originally was at Yovel, because it's as if we purchased it. Now, if you purchase land from someone, it goes back in Yovel. So at Yovel, whatever land I took is now equally owned by both of us. So it wasn't all those years, but it is now. So now what do you see here? Ein breira. Because if you would hold breira, then you basically would hold that when we divide up the land, it's as if when our father died, this part was mine, this part was yours. And you don't have any rights to mine, and I don't have any rights to yours, because breira works to basically say retroactive designation is that when the father died, this was mine. And you have no rights to it at all. So Yovel year, it's not going to go back. Now the question is, so first, it's kind of nice to say, oh, look, Rabbi Yochanan's consistent within his approach. But that leads us to the next question, which is, well, if he's consistent with his approach, why does he need to say it in both places? We could have learned one from the other. Utsricha. But no, you need them both. Gemara doesn't actually ask the question. They just come and explain, well, by the way, in case you would ask, why do you need to say it in both places? I'll explain. Di'i itmar baha. Let's say you just said it by the case of the get, that breira doesn't work. Retroactive designation does not kick in. You would have said, baha ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan de'ein breira. Specifically, maybe here Rabbi Yochanan holds there's no breira, retroactive designation. Why? Mishum to be in on la lishma, because here there's a special law, because Torah says, v'katav la, has to be written specifically per. You can't write it in this ambiguous way, whichever one I give it to, and then later decide, and then retroactively it'll work. Because of the law of lishma, it's a unique halacha of lishma. It wouldn't necessarily apply to other places. Aval hatam, but there, when it comes to the inheritance, you might say, when does the Torah say Yovel goes back? When you sell your land. So maybe you would say, only a sale, the Torah says, goes back in the Yovel year. Aval Yerusha u'matanalo, but maybe a gift or an inheritance wouldn't return to the original owners, and therefore you wouldn't say ein breira there. You would say maybe it doesn't really go back in the Yovel year because you got that part, I got my part, and whether we hold, maybe retroactive designation would work, and we would then say it's mine, and it was mine from the beginning. It doesn't have to go back in the Yovel year. The Yeshminan said, yeah, let's go the reverse way. So let's say you only had it in the Yovel case, in the case of the brothers splitting up the property. If you had that case, now notice, there we hold ein breira, and saying ein breira leads to astringency. What does it lead to? It leads to that now the land has to go back in the Yovel year. So you would have said, we say ein breira mishum de l'chumra. We say it because we need to be strict and say, we're going to be strict and say there's no breira to basically make the land go back in the Yovel year. Because we're not sure, is there breira, isn't there breira, let's just be strict. Inami, alternatively, you could say, for a different reason, maybe it has nothing to do with breira. Maybe it's kitchila. Yovel is always that things have to revert back to the way they were before. Well, the way they were before, the last Yovel, they belonged to our father. Our father's now dead, but we have to kind of revert it back to the fact that it was owned by our father. It goes back to that. When it was owned by the father, basically that means we all have equal rights to all of the property. So maybe it just needs to revert back. It's a special law by Yovel. Aval hacha. But here, if we'd say, what's the chumrah? Okay, if we go back to the first option of it's just l'chumrah, the chumrah here would be to say yesh breira. There is retroactive designation, in which case the get is a get, in which case the woman can't stay married to a kohen. Right? Again, we would never say it's definitely a get, but if we be strict and say, let's be concerned that maybe breira works, we would actually go l'chumrah in that direction and not ein breira. If we say ein breira, again, let's just remember, if we say there's no retroactive designation by the land case, then that means that it all goes back to Yovel. I'm going to be strict. If we say ein breira in our case, it means this get is not a get, in which case the woman can stay married to a kohen. That's lakula. So hacha emalo, you might say here, maybe we don't say ein breira, tzricha, and that's why you need him to tell you, no. We say ein breira, whether it's l'chumra, whether it's l'kula. We just don't hold by retroactive designation. That's the first part of our study. So we have the 4 opinions. Today we saw 2 more. Yesterday we saw Rav and Shmuel. Today's 2 opinions really went around the question of, is there brera, isn't there brera? The first opinion, Ze'eri said, we have to be concerned there's brera, and therefore she can't marry, she can't stay married to a kohen or marry a kohen down the road. And Rabbi Yochanan says there is no brera, not even to be strict with this woman. What he said the same thing when it came to the land case, and then we just explained why he needed both cases. Now we're going to have a question. This is going to take us all the way to the end of tomorrow, to the daf today, and a little into tomorrow's daf. So Rav Shai asked Rav Yehuda the following question, something similar to our Mishnah, but a little bit different. Amar le'labla, he says to the sofer, the scribe, Tov le'ezo shetetzeh b'petach tchila. He has two wives with the same name. He says, write it in the name of my wife that walks out the door first. This sounds like a Yiftach, Jephthah's daughter kind of thing. So, but different because it's a get. So write it for whichever one comes out of the door first. Mahu, what's the law? So Rav Oshaya asks this of Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda answers, Amalei, Tani Tua. It's the same thing as our Mishnah. Yater Mikain, what did our Mishnah say? More than that. Amar le'lablal, Tov le'ezo she'ertzeh agaresh, pasul le'garesh bo. If you write to whichever one I divorce, then whichever one I decide later I'm going to divorce, pasul le'garesh bo, he cannot use this as a get. Alma, what can we infer from there? Ein brera. There's no retroactive designation. If retroactive designation worked, it would have worked there and it would have been a get. But it doesn't work, and therefore it doesn't work in the case where he says whichever one comes out the door first, it would be the exact same thing. You would need retroactive designation for that to work, and it doesn't. Ative, but now Rav Oshaya questions Rav Yehuda back. So Rav Oshaya asked a question of Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda answered it from our Mishnah. Rav Oshaya throws back a question. You want to say based on our Mishnah there's no laws of brera? I'm going to show you a case where it seems there is brera. I think it's a Mishnah. So let me double check that. Yeah, it's a Mishnah in Pesachim. Okay, I'm sure you'll remember this Mishnah. It was very memorable. The background you need to know is that when you do the Korban Pesach, whoever joins your Korban Pesach, it needs to be decided before you slaughter the animal. You can only slaughter the animal on people who were registered already for the Korban Pesach. So now here comes our situation. I'm going to slaughter this animal for whoever gets to Jerusalem first. Sounds like he's only going to give it to one of his kids, and whichever one gets there first, he's the one. Seems like in the interim, he slaughters the animal, and whichever son comes first, the one who gets into Jerusalem first, the majority, his head and the majority of his body, he gets his portion. Here comes a little bit of a strange part. He brings his other brothers along, meaning he gets there first, so he gets rights to it, and he shares his rights in the Korban Pesach with his brothers. We have to figure out exactly how this works. If everyone has to be registered before, they weren't registered before, how does it work? Anyway, right now, what do you see? That retroactively, right, we use retroactive designation. The father slaughtered the Korban Pesach with the intent of whichever one came in first. Then one of them comes in first, so retroactively it was designated that he was the one, and he gets rights to eat the Korban Pesach, and then again he brings his brothers with him. We'll have to figure out how that works. So what do you see here? Yesh brera. You can use retroactive designation. So basically, Rav Oshaya asked a question, can we use retroactive designation if you say whoever comes out the door first? Rav Yehuda tried to answer from our Mishnah, Ein brera. There is no retroactive designation. This wouldn't work. And Rav Oshaya says, but wait, what do you do with this other Mishnah where it seems there is retroactive designation? To which, Amarle, Hoshaya Barei, Rav Yehuda says to him, Hoshaya, my son, how are you comparing this Pesach case to get? This has absolutely nothing to do with it. And not because that's Korban Pesach and that's get, but because you didn't even understand the Mishnah properly. It was said about that Mishnah, Amal Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, what was going on here? He was just making a competition to get his kids to be excited about the mitzvah and run to Jerusalem so they get there in time. He wanted to get them there on time. He didn't really mean only one of you, and he really meant, of course he had in mind, all his children were going to be registered in the Korban Pesach. And Daikanami, Dekatani, you can even further prove that, because what does it say? And this was the part we didn't really understand. First one comes his head and the majority of his body. So now, how did he get his other brothers involved? If the father had those other kids in mind from the beginning, and all he was trying to do was create some competition, friendly competition between the sons to get them to rush to Jerusalem, then Shapir, then it makes sense that the rest of the brothers could join with the other brother and eat the Korban Pesach. But if he didn't appoint them, didn't agree to register them all, and he really only registered the first one, then can't possibly be la'achar shchita mika mitmenu. How could the brother be zocheh the other brothers to be part of the Korban Pesach? Once it's already slaughtered, you can't change who's going to be registered for this Korban Pesach. So there, the Hadran, doesn't it say in the Mishna, you can change and decide to switch Korban Pesach. You can do that until the moment of the slaughtering. Once the animal is slaughtered, you can't change. Wherever you're registered, that's where you are. You can't go to somewhere where you weren't registered. So therefore, what do we see here? We see that this whole case of the Korban Pesach has absolutely nothing to do with retroactive designation. Okay, so what Rav Oshaya tried to bring as a question to Rav Yehuda and say, look, there's braita from here, is totally not the case. And that's what Rav Yehuda tells him. This case is really, there's no halachic issues going on here. The father's just trying to motivate his kids to get to the temple. And that's why he said, whoever gets there first will be part of it. But of course he intended them all to be part of it. And therefore, don't question me from there. One further proof, and it's a good source, I'm sure you'll remember this, for those who learned it, there's a braita to support this in Psachim, which says, it also comes up, by the way, in Yoma, saw this already 3 times, I see in the Masoret HaShas, quotes 3 different dapim in the Gemara where this comes up, although 2 are right near each other. Tanya Namihachi, a braita to support, Ma'aseh kadmu banot labanim. There was a case where a father did this, and the girls got there before the boys. Hey, way to go, girls. Girl power. And what is the braita? What is the comment of the braita on this? You see here that the girls were, they rushed and they were very excited about doing the mitzvah. And the boys were, shvalim means low lives, right? They were low, they were, lazy, they were useless. And what do you see though? It's more what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the girls ended up being part of the Korban Pesach and the boys didn't. No, because that's not the issue here. The issue is just trying lizarzam b'mitzvot, to get them to be excited and to quickly do the mitzvah and get to Jerusalem, but it has nothing to do with our topic at all. Now, before we go on, I'm just going to do a quick review. We're going to look at the study guide and see it on the chart. A quick review of the sugya, and then we're going to jump to a different perspective on the sugya. So we started with Rav Oshaya's question. If you tell the sofer, which this is going to be for whichever of my wives comes out first, remember they have the same name, right? And then he wants to know, does that work or does it not work? Is there braita or is there not braita? Rav Yehuda answered from our Mishna. You see, there is no braita when it comes to this get case. Rav Oshaya said, what about the case of Psachim where we see there is braita? To which Rav Yehuda answered him, that case has nothing to do with braita. It's irrelevant. But comes Abaye and he looks at this whole thing. Amar Abaye says, there's something I don't understand. When Rav Oshaya asked the question, and here I'm in the chart, that's a case of tole. These cases where Rav Oshaya asks and Rav Yehuda answers from the Mishnah are very different. They're different because there's a difference in a case where I want to retroactively designate something based on an action I'm going to do or based on an action someone else is going to do. So Rav Oshaya's question was asked about whoever, right? It was, what if we say to the sofer, write my get for the one who will come out first? That's what we call tole b'dat achirim. That all depends on the women and who walks out the door first. V'kapashle, when he answered it from a totally different case. Tole b'dat atzmo, a case where it was all dependent on his opinion, right? That was on what he decides. For the one that I decide later. And perhaps, right, and then Hadar motively. And when Rav Oshaya questions him back from the case of Psachim, even though he rejects it. But the point is, it's also tole b'dat achirim. That's more similar to Rav Oshaya's question, where whoever gets there first, that's not dependent on the person who's doing the Korban Pesach and deciding, it's dependent on someone else's actions. So now, what we're going to say is that maybe you would hold ein breira in the case of the Mishnah, where it's dependent on your own opinion and what you're going to decide later. Maybe there we don't hold retroactive designation. You should have done it now. But when you want to depend it on somebody else, maybe braver would work. And that's what Abaye questions about this whole back and forth of Rav Hoshai and Rav Yehuda. To which Rava very simply answers, Amar Rava, my kushya, I don't understand your question. Why can't you just say, Dilma, maybe, mandi ile brera, whoever holds there is brera, and holds by retroactive designation, lo shnato lebedat atzmo, lo shnato lebedat acheri. It makes no difference whether it's your own opinion or whether it's dependent on what you decide later or dependent on what's going to happen later. Either way, ile brera. Uman delay brera, and the one who doesn't hold by retroactive designation, lo shnato lebedat atzmo, lo shnato lebedat acherim le brera. It doesn't matter if you hold there's no retroactive designation. Who's to say that that really is a difference, whether it's dependent on you or whether it's dependent on someone else? Either which way, you could hold ain brera. So Abaye tries to question this whole back and forth and say, it doesn't make any sense that you're comparing apples and oranges. And Rava basically says, who's to say they're apples and oranges? Maybe they're red apples and green apples, and it doesn't make a difference. They're all apples, right? They're all, for this issue of whether you hold retroactive designation or not, it shouldn't matter, whether it's up to you or up to somebody else. But Amarle Rav Misharshia Rav. Rav Misharshia now questions Rava, and the rest of today's stuff is really going to be his question, and only tomorrow we'll get to his answer. Rav Misharshia says to Rav, I'm going to show you that there's a distinction, because I'm going to show you Rav Yehuda's opinion, and I'm going to show you Rabbi Shimon's opinion. And both of them distinguish between a case where it's up to you and up to somebody else. And then you're going to see that there is this distinction, and it's going to fit exactly with the distinction that Abaye said, that if it's your own decision, brera is not going to work. If it's someone else's decision, it's based on what someone else is going to decide, then brera does work. So let's see. Now we're going to quote the most famous case of brera that always comes up in the brera sugyas. So he says, V'ha Rabbi Yehuda. So he starts with Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, but look, Rabbi Yehuda, ditola b'dat atzmo leit lebrera, v'tola b'dat acherim eat lebrera. He distinguishes between, if it's dependent on his own sake, then he doesn't hold brera. If it's on his own decision, no brera. If it's dependent on what someone else does, someone else's action, there is brera. So how so? Tola b'dat atzmo leit lebrera. Where does Rabbi Yehuda hold if it's dependent on your own decision? There's no brera. Ditanya, here's the famous case. Halokech yain, you purchase wine, mibein akutim. Okay, there's a whole debate about this case of purchasing wine. Is it because you didn't have Is it you did it like Friday afternoon just before Shabbos and you couldn't do it on Shabbos? Is it because you don't have another vessel on you to separate the Truma and Masro? But the basic point is you bought wine from a kuti. Kutim, with the Shomronim, there's concern that they don't take Truma and Masro. So you can't eat this because it's safek whether there was Truma and Masro separate. And now you have this wine and you want to separate. So, but you can't because either it's Shabbos or you don't have anything to put it into. So what do? You make a declaration, Amal. You say the following: Shnei lugin, 2 log, shani ati lachlish, harei hein tchum. 2 log that I'm going to eventually take out of here. That's 1/50th because you have 100 log. Is truma. Asara, 10 log, is maser rishon. You basically say later I'm going to take out. Okay, whatever I take out, that will be my maser. That will be my truma. Tisha maser sheni, 9 log of here is maser sheni because that's a 10th of what's left because you already took out 10 plus 2. So you have 88 really. Really the first maser is really only 9.8. They don't do decimals here. So they say 10. Then it's a 10th of 9.8. Okay. So, right. That gets you to, again, rounded numbers. It's going to be 9, even though it's really, right, 8.8. Umechal v'shotem miyad. Okay. And then, sorry, what did I just say? 9.8, right? You take out 10, you're left with 88. So now 8.8 will be what you take. Now, the Maser Sheni is supposed to redeem on a coin and bring to Jerusalem. So you redeem it on a coin. And then once you've made this declaration, Shotemiyad, you can drink right away according to Rabbi Meir. Why? Because Yesh Breira. Because what do we say? Just make sure to leave. Now, at the end, you have to leave the 2 log for Truma, the 10 log for Maser Sheni. So you have to leave 12 log over at the bottom of this. So you can drink the rest of it. The 9 for Maser Sheni, you don't have to leave anymore because you already redeemed it on a coin. And then you can drink the rest of it and just leave it at the bottom. Why? Because Rabbi Meir holds yesh breira. Now, this is dependent on you, because in the end, what's the problem? The problem is that this is wine. It's not like you have a pile of fruits and you could just say the ones at the bottom and you can designate them. Here, the wine's going to keep moving around. You're going to drink some and the ones from the bottom are going to come to the top and move around. You can't do that with wine. So Rabbi Meir holds, this is retroactive designation. When in the end, I'm left with the 12 log, I can say that that 12 log was the one that I was referring to from the beginning. That's breira. We want to find, though, that Rabbi Yehuda is going to say there's no breira because this is a case, and it's a case of toleh b'dat atzmo. It's all dependent on him. He's going to leave that 12 log over at the end. So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, and Rabbi Shimon, they all forbid this. They say this doesn't work. We're assuming right now it doesn't work because ein breira. So now what do you see? We've proven that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who we're going to get to only later, but Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yossi, we're not going to talk about at all, they hold ein breira in a place where it's dependent on your own decision. And there we see toleh b'dat acherim. That was toleh b'dat atzmo, ein breira. Now, toleh b'dat acherim itle breira. So now where's the case where if you're dependent on other people, there is breira? Well, that's ditnan. It says in the Mishna, mahi ba'otane yamim. So you need Rashi to help us here. Rashi says we're talking about a case. It comes up later in Gittin, daf ayin gimel. This will be your get from now. If I die from this disease, you have a guy who's sick. He's worried he's going to die. If he dies, what will happen? His wife, he has no kids, so his wife is going to have to do yibum, marry his brother, or do chalitza. He wants to spare her that. So he says, I'm going to give you a get upon condition. If I die from this sickness, this will be your get, and he says the words me'achshav, from now. Now, if he dies, right? So if we say the get will work, if he dies, the get will work, right? When he dies. But when he dies, it'll turn out that there is no get after death. So the get will have kicked in from now. So now the Mishnah says, Mahi ba'otani yamin. Well, all those days now. Is the get starting now? If the get is effective now, she's not married already. But no, Rabbi Yehuda omer harehi ke'eshet ish l'chod bareha. She's considered married for all intents and purposes right now. Only when he eventually, if he were to die down the road, then it will be retroactive that from now she was actually divorced. But as long as he doesn't die, she's not divorced. So what do you see from Rabbi Yehuda? Why, when he dies, will she retroactively be divorced? Because he said, if I die, it's like saying whoever comes out first from the door, because it's not dependent on him. It's dependent on God, right? It's dependent on some unknown factor, really, of is he going to die from this disease or not? And then it turns out this breira works. She'll be retroactively divorced from before. So you see that in a case where it's dependent on somebody else, in this case, God, basically retroactive designation works. So there you see Rav Misharshia saying to Rava, why did you say there's no distinction? Here, person who says ein breira only says it in a case where it's dependent on themselves. Depending on other people, he holds there is breira. And furthermore, Amrle Rav Misharshia Rava, he continues to say, Rabbi Shimon de tola b'dat atzmo leit lebreira, v'tola b'dat acherim eat lebreira. Rabbi Shimon makes the exact same distinction. Let's see. Tola b'dat atzmo leit lebreira. If he's dependent on his own sake, there's no breira. Hadamara, that we know, because we already said that was the case with the wine and the kuti, that it doesn't work. He was osir just like Rabbi Yehuda, so it's dependent on him, and there's no breira. Tola b'dat acherim eat lebreira. Where do we see Rabbi Shimon holding that if it's dependent on other people, there is such thing as retroactive designation? Ditanya, you'll find this case a little bit strange, but somebody says, Hareini bo'alech amanat shirtzeh ab. Somebody betroths a woman through bi'ah, through having sexual relations with her, which is one of the three methods you can, with the intent to betroth her, but with the intent to betroth her upon condition. He says, only if my father is approving of this betrothal. So according to Tanakama, if you ask the father later and the father says, I wasn't interested, I don't want you marrying this girl or betrothing this woman, you're married anyway, or you're betrothed. This was a betrothal. Why are you betrothed? Because there's a concept that we assume that in Adam oseh bi'lato bi'latznud, a person's not going to have relations with a woman, and it turns out then it was wrong. It wasn't right. It was just out of marriage. It was for no good reason. Because, right, the assumption is if he said, I'm doing this to betroth you as long as my father agrees. What he really means is, I assume my father agrees. And therefore, he really intended 100% to betroth her. That's not relevant for our purposes. But the next opinion is, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon's quoted by a different Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. Ratzah ha'av mikudeshet. If the father, we ask the father later and we check. If the father says, yes, I like this woman, I'm happy for him to betroth this woman, she's mikudeshet, she's betrothed. Lo ratzah ha'av, but if he doesn't want it, eina mikudeshet, then she's not. Here you see retroactive designation when it's dependent on somebody else. So there you have both Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda distinguish between tolebedat atzmo, tolebedat acherim. In one case, they're going to say no breira when it's based on your own opinion. When it's based on someone else's opinion, they say yesh breira. So that leads us to Rav Sharshia questioning Rava and basically supporting Abaye, who basically said, I don't understand why. Rav Hoshaya asked a question about tolebedat acherim, it's dependent on other people, and Rabbi Yehuda answered from our Mishna, which is a case dependent on his own opinion. Just because they ain't breira there doesn't necessarily mean there is breira there. Okay, so just to do a quick review of the daf, we just kind of did a quick review of that last part, but let's just do from the top. So we have the four machlokot, the four opinions about which of these cases in the Mishnah, if any, disqualify the woman from marrying a kohen or don't disqualify a woman from marrying a kohen. We saw four different options. We strengthened Rab Ze'eri by saying Rabbi Asi says the same thing. We strengthened Rabbi Yehuda, or at least just say Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his opinion elsewhere with the brothers and the distribution of the property. Then we had to explain why we needed Rabbi Yochanan to say actually in both cases. Couldn't we learn one from the other? Then we went to this question. Rabbi Shai asked Rabbi Yehuda about if he says, write me a get for whichever wife comes out first, does that work? Is there breira? Isn't there not breira? Rabbi Yehuda answered it from our Mishnah. We learned there is no breira. Rav Hoshaya asked back, what about the Pesachim case? To which Rabbi Yehuda said the Pesachim case has nothing to do with breira at all. It was all just a father trying to encourage his kids to do things, but it's not a halachic braita at all, or Mishnah at all. Then Abaye said, and that we just reviewed, how are you comparing apples and oranges? These cases are very different. The one you asked, the one you answered, and the one that Rav Shaya then questioned about from Pesachim. There was a zigzagging back and forth between depending on other people's decisions and your own decisions. Rava said, who cares? Whoever says yesh breira across the board. Whoever says ain't breira, there's breira across the board. So it doesn't make a difference, to which Rav Masharshia right now tries to say, no, there is a difference. And he basically tries to prove that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, because of the wine case, where you see they don't allow breira, and the other cases where they each say we do allow breira, and the distinction is it your own decision or is it other people's decision? What we'll see tomorrow is, in order to neutralize Rav Masharshia's question, we're going to explain the reason why Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yosef forbid in the case of the wine has nothing to do with breira, it has to do with something else. Okay, it's not because they hold ein breira, it's actually because they hold there's a different issue here. And that we'll get to tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.